Imagine yourself strapped into the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, soaring above Nazi-held territory in France, with your altimeter showing 18,000 feet, the typical height for a fighter's sweep. From this vantage, the landscape stretches out endlessly. The quilted fields of countryside, the gleaming thread of the Seine winding through the terrain, and the ominous shadows of Luftwaffe bases dotting the ground far below. Up here, a sense of security washes over you. But that illusion crumbles quickly. During the sweltering months of 1943, U.S. fighter jocks were perishing at these very elevations quicker than the Army Air Forces could train fresh replacements to fill their seats. The statistics painted a grim picture. From June through September of that year, the 8th Air Force suffered the downing of 214 fighter planes across European skies. These losses stemmed not from engine breakdowns or depleted fuel supplies, but from encounters with German interceptors that boasted superior climb rates, sharper maneuverability, and years of combat seasoning in these very heavens dating back to 1940. The enemy's Bf-109s and FW-190s dominated the airspace from 15,000 to 25,000 feet. They had mastered the art of the surprise attack, plunging from the glare of the sun to rake a P-47 with bursts from their 20mm cannons, then pulling away to higher ground before the stunned American aviator could react. Each pre-flight briefing devolved into a grim forecast of who might not return. Leading the 56th Fighter Group out of Halesworth was Major Hubbs Zemke, and come August 1943, he had witnessed far too many vacant spots at the officers' tables in the dining hall. The established combat strategies were falling short. The Army Air Forces had drilled into every flyer the imperative of holding the high ground, engaging in three-dimensional dogfights, and refusing to surrender even a sliver of elevation. This approach was treated as unbreakable doctrine. This approach was proving fatal for pilots on all sides. Zemke began to contemplate the unthinkable. Could it be that gaining height was the real issue rather than the fix? Might the key lie in descending instead of climbing? The notion appeared utterly mad. Operating at low altitudes would blind you to approaching dangers. A single error could send you smashing into the ground of France with no time to recover. It would require traveling at speeds sluggish enough for German anti-aircraft fire to lock on and follow. All standard military doctrines warned that skimming low in single-engine fighters amounted to certain death during penetration missions. Yet Zemke examined the tally of those vanished Tu-14 planes and posed a straightforward query. Relative to what alternative? What about in light of the prevailing odds of making it through? That approach had proven just as futile. During September 1943, Zemke discreetly drew 3 of his seasoned aviators to one side: Captain Walker Marin, Lieutenant Bob Johnson, and Captain Jerry Johnson. He instructed them to disregard all prior training on maintaining proper heights. On the upcoming sortie, once the responsibility of shielding the bombers had concluded, their orders were to descend sharply. Not merely to 10,000 feet, or even 5,000, but right to the deck. Brush the treetops and observe the outcome. Should they face a military trial as a result, he would shoulder the full responsibility. The trio exchanged glances. Each had suffered the loss of a comrade in the skies over the previous month. They gave their assent. On that fateful day of September 27, 1943, the trio of P-47s plunged from an altitude of 18,000 feet down to just 200 feet above the rolling landscapes of rural France. Skimming so close to the ground, They startled local farmers into scrambling for cover in nearby ditches. Pushing their engines to the limit at 350 miles per hour, with throttles jammed fully open, the pilots hurtled onward. Then came an unforeseen discovery, spotting a Luftwaffe base close to Beauvais, where FW-190s sat neatly arrayed like playthings on the tarmac. The Americans caught the enemy completely off guard. The German aviators had no inkling of the approaching threat. At the height of their propellers, the P-47s roared over the runway, their machine guns blazing relentlessly. In moments, 4 of the FW-190s burst into flames, erupting before the defending gunners could even scramble to their anti-aircraft stations. The 3 U.S. pilots then climbed slightly, hugging the terrain to evade pursuit, and successfully returned to base. No casualties on our side, but 4 enemy aircraft downed. In that moment, a transformative shift in warfare was underway. Skimming along at the height of the treetops went far beyond mere low-altitude flight. It meant harnessing the laws of nature to completely reverse the strengths held by the Germans. Operating just 50 feet above the ground, while pushing 350 miles per hour, rendered the conventional principles of dogfighting utterly illogical for all involved, save for the pilot pulling it off. Across France, the Luftwaffe maintained a network of radar installations featuring advanced Freya and Würzburg setups capable of detecting Allied groups from 80 miles away when they flew high. These systems would guide Bf-109 fighters into position, allowing ample opportunity to gain height, maneuver, and strike. Yet radar signals propagate in straight paths, while the planet's surface bends. Drop under 500 feet, and you'd vanish amid the phenomenon known to radar crews as ground clutter. The chaotic echoes reflecting from terrain features like hills, structures, and foliage. At 50 feet, total concealment was yours. You transformed into a spectral force racing over French landscapes at a blistering 6 miles every minute. That edge and response speed proved utterly crippling. Imagine a young German aviator, just 18 years old, stationed at an advanced base and settling into the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190 as its motor idles in preparation for a dawn flight. Operating at an elevation of 18,000 feet, radar operators would alert him with a 3-minute heads-up, allowing ample opportunity to scramble airborne, climb to height, and ready for action. Yet, when the assault came in at a mere 50 feet, the initial signal was nothing more than the thunderous roar of Pratt & Whitney R-2800 power plants echoing above the forest edge. From that auditory cue to the moment of collision, only 11 seconds elapsed. Far too brief to dash toward one's plane, to crew the anti-aircraft batteries, or even to fully grasp the imminent peril of death. U.S. flyers began surprising Luftwaffe interceptors while they sat stationary on the tarmac, their landing gear secured, and air crews still scrambling aboard. This wasn't warfare in the traditional sense. It was outright massacre. The vast difference in velocities turned into a decisive edge for staying alive. A thunderbolt roaring along the surface at maximum power, clocking 350 miles per hour, outpaced the abilities of German anti-air defenses accustomed to engaging foes far overhead. Operators of heavy flak adjusted their aiming points by estimating the enemy's future position based on its height and velocity, rather than firing at its current spot. However, skimming just above the terrain rendered those computations useless. An 88mm round might take so long to arrive at the predicted intercept that the attacker had already streaked a full quarter-mile beyond it. As for lighter defenses, the 20mm and 37mm cannons, they demanded steady visual acquisition and predictable trajectories from their targets. The low-level intruder offered none of that, streaking by as an indistinct flash that materialized and disappeared before the crew could even register the sighting through their sights. Compounding the challenge was the difficulty of chasing such a raider. Suppose a Messerschmitt Bf-109 detects the threat and plunges downward to intercept, holding an advantage in velocity, angle, and apparent dominance. In truth, though, victory eluded him. At treetop height, the slightest miscalculation in his pursuit could send him smashing into a slope or foliage. The American wasn't merely dodging gunfire, he was compelling the pursuer to weigh the option of downing his opponent against the certainty of his own destruction. Typically, the German pilots would break off and climb away. Their doctrine emphasized battles in the stratosphere, where thousands of feet of buffer space below provided a margin for mistakes. No one had prepared them for aerial duels in the realm of treetops, where even eagles would struggle. The dynamics of fear shifted dramatically. In an instant, the pursuer found himself gripped by dread, while the pursued settled into a sense of ease. U.S. aviators learned to harness the landscape much as submariners exploit underwater depths. Encounter a Messerschmitt Bf-109? Dive down into a stream gorge and trace its winding path. The enemy aircraft would either break off sight or trail you through a labyrinth of ridges, transforming its superior velocity into a dangerous hindrance. Notice a settlement ahead? Barrel right through its heart, employing structures for concealment, steeple tops, elevated reservoirs, rows of foliage. Every feature of the earth now served as strategic concealment. Once masters of the airspace, the German Air Force watched as the Yanks commandeered the terrain below and wielded it like a deadly tool. The laws of nature paid no heed to tactical theories, and skimming just 50 feet above the surface, those laws tilted decisively in favor of the United States. Republic aviation never intended the P-47 Thunderbolt for such rugged, ground-hugging duties. The aircraft had been crafted as a formidable high-altitude interceptor, a colossal 7-ton beast engineered to shield bombers while soaring at 25,000 feet, where the atmosphere grew sparse and turbochargers proved essential. Powered by its enormous R-2800 engine, which delivered 2,000 horsepower, the plane excelled in steep ascents and superior handling amid the upper skies. Yet, by the closing months of 1943, aviators began deploying these behemoths perilously close to the earth, returning to base with mangled undersides, compromised oil coolers, and stories of collisions that defied survival odds. The design team at Republic soon recognized that they had unwittingly created an ideal machine for low-altitude combat. All that remained was to refine it properly. The initial upgrades focused squarely on endurance. From December 1943 onward, Republic's technicians installed half-inch-thick armor sheets along the P-47's underbelly and the base of its engine housing. This shielding wasn't meant to repel gunfire. Instead, it guarded against the hazards of France itself. Flying mere 50 feet off the ground involved evading not only hostile shots, but also foliage, utility cables, and sheer recklessness. Airmen were routinely shearing off limbs from trees, tearing through communication lines, and miraculously keeping their crafts aloft. With the added underbody protection, a brush with overhead branches, inevitable rather than avoidable, now offered a fighting chance of making it through intact. Following incidents where 3 flyers nursed their damaged birds back to base after arboreal debris had breached their cooling setups, the crew fitted sturdier mounts encircling the oil cooler. In one striking case, Lieutenant Francis Gabreski touched down at Halesworth with a full 6-foot limb jammed into his undercarriage. The reinforced plating had preserved the vital hydraulic conduits. Adjustments to the gun sight, though less obvious, carried equal weight in importance. The conventional N9 reflector gun sight had been tuned for deflection-style shooting from high up, anticipating a target's twists and turns across vast distances in 3 dimensions, often miles below. Down on the ground, though, the objectives stayed put. They consisted of immobile assets like grounded planes, train engines, tanker vehicles for fuel, and lines of supply vehicles. What pilots required was a sighting system capable of locking onto such marks in mere moments, given just 2 seconds of visibility while hurtling along at 350 mm Mioche. Starting in February 1944, the Republic team started fitting out the aircraft with altered K-14 gyroscopic sights, recalibrated for distance, which effectively transformed the Thunderbolt into a weapon that handled its own aiming. All it took was centering the pipper on the objective, pulling the trigger, and letting the 850 caliber Browning machine guns obliterate anything in your line of sight. They also revamped the wing-mounted racks. While the P-47 had the capacity for bombs, the usual shackles suited drops from elevation. Releasing a 500-pound bomb from only 50 feet up would backfire catastrophically, with the explosion claiming the attacker just as surely as the enemy. Drawing from methods refined in the Pacific Theater, engineers adapted skip bombing for low-level operations. Pilots would charge toward a bridge or fortified position at full throttle, letting go at the final instant so the bomb would ricochet like a flat stone on a pond. Only here, it bounded over solid ground right into a German storage site for fuel. The P-47 D-25 model, introduced in March 1944, featured strengthened wing roots built expressly to endure the strains of recovering from these daring dives. Yet the key upgrade went beyond hardware. It centered on strategic preparation. Come April 1944, incoming pilots in England underwent a fresh certification program at Atcham. They navigated routes skimming 50 feet above the rural English landscape, honing their ability to interpret the ground features amid velocities that punished any delay with disaster. They drilled quick shots against surface objectives, mastering marksmanship in fleeting 1-second bursts. They maintained group flights at the level of hedgerows until such proximity seemed routine rather than reckless. The trainers were veterans who had endured 2 full months of actual combat over French skies. Their core message boiled down to this: staying high dooms you, velocity protects you, and the P-47 absorbs punishment that would shred any rival plane. Rely on the machine, control your height, and you could survive to return stateside. On April 8, 1944, that marked the moment the Luftwaffe realized no spot remained secure. For half a year, Colonel Hubert Zemke had been methodically refining the low-level treetop maneuver, cycling aviators through the specialized hedge-hopping training program, poring over classified assessments of enemy airstrip positions, and biding his time until conditions aligned for a full-scale strike. The opportunity finally emerged as mild spring skies swept away the clouds across Normandy. coupled with fresh reconnaissance verifying that the Luftwaffe's premier units, Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26, were shuttling their squadrons in and out of advanced outposts close to Évreux and Bernay. The enemy believed these sites were secure, nestled some 60 miles from the front lines and shielded by anti-aircraft guns, along with radar detection systems. In truth, their assumptions proved disastrously mistaken. Zemke orchestrated a synchronized assault, deploying 48 P-47 aircraft drawn from the 56th, 78th, and 353rd fighter groups. This mission carried no bomber protection duties and avoided any elevated sweeps, focusing solely on intense ground-level pursuit. Once beyond the French shoreline, the squadrons divided into smaller units, descending first to 100 feet and then to 50, roaring over the Norman landscape in formations of 4 planes each. Later accounts from French underground observers described how the vibrations rattled the earth beneath them. The initial element struck Évreux precisely at air weight 47 hours. There, 16 Bf-109s sat exposed on the airfield in differing stages of preparation, certain ones rolling forward, others in the midst of refueling, and a few with their pilots just settling into the cockpits. Suddenly, the P-47s burst through the early mist, racing at 360 meters. The enemy anti-aircraft crews had no opportunity to fire. Within a mere 90 seconds, 11 Bf-109s lay as smoldering wrecks, while the American pilots had vanished into the distance, speeding onward to their backup objectives. The elegance of this synchronized assault lay in its precise synchronization. The Luftwaffe's organizational framework relied heavily on radio links and unified oversight. Once Évreux suffered the initial blow, efforts were made to alert nearby installations, yet the attackers had already shifted positions. Bernay endured its strike just 8 minutes following the assault on Évreux. Beaumont-le-Roger followed suit 4 minutes later. Luftwaffe directors scrambled to guide interceptors toward dangers that had long since struck and departed. It resembled wielding a massive hammer against elusive insects, even as those insects ravaged the very structure of one's home. By 09:20 hours, P-47s had assaulted 7 distinct airfields spread across a 40-mile expanse. Those German aviators who succeeded in taking off discovered themselves pursuing elusive objectives beyond visual range, operating at heights where any error could result in instant destruction. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, among Zemke's initial trio of test subjects from September, commanded a squadron that surprised a staffel of FW-190s at Conches Airfield, right in the midst of their early briefing. The German crew stood adjacent to their planes as Johnson's group roared across the perimeter barrier. Footage from Johnson's gun camera captures the ensuing chaos, footage that remains harrowing to view even after 8 decades. FW-190s bursting into blazing spheres, aviators dashing toward shelter, fuel vehicles detonating and igniting flames along the taxiway. In his post-mission summary, Johnson maintained a detached tone. 4 aircraft eliminated on the ground, 2 others likely destroyed, severe impairment to fuel reserves. No opposing gunfire faced. The duration of the assault lasted just 11 seconds. Those 11 seconds obliterated 2 full years of effort in training Luftwaffe personnel and maintaining their equipment. During that intense week in April, the American pilots' campaign, which they dubbed the Chattanooga Choo-Choo Runs once it broadened to include attacks on rail lines, resulted in 47 verified German planes wrecked while stationary, 23 engines pulling trains reduced to wreckage, and an immense number of vehicles, storage sites for fuel, and explosive stockpiles blasted into rubble-filled holes. In return, the Americans sacrificed only 3 P-47s, one felled by anti-aircraft fire, another from colliding with an unseen electrical wire, and the third due to mechanical trouble during the return flight. This yielded a lopsided exchange rate of 15 German losses for every American one, prompting an urgent outcry from every Luftwaffe airfield leader across France for additional anti-aircraft batteries, enhanced concealment measures, and whatever else could thwart the low-flying, relentless P-47s. Listeners could plainly detect the panic in intercepted German communications. Once the pursuers, the Luftwaffe now found themselves pursued, utterly at a loss for effective countermeasures. Upon reviewing the casualty figures from April, General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who oversaw the Luftwaffe's fighter operations, instantly recognized the dire peril confronting his entire aerial command. Combat attrition of planes was manageable. Replacements could be built, fresh aviators schooled. Yet the destruction of aircraft on the tarmac, coupled with the loss of supply vehicles, munitions reserves, and support staff, drained resources at a pace that outstripped even the faltering German supply line's ability to compensate. On April 19, 1944, Galland dispatched Directive 487 to all Jagdverbände leaders stationed in France, ordering them to shift plane parking zones no closer than 800 meters to the runways, bolster anti-aircraft defenses along incoming routes, and set up lookout systems among the local communities encircling each base. Such measures amounted to little more than a hasty patch on a life-threatening wound, a fact Galland fully appreciated. Repositioning the flak units came about right away, as it demanded the least complication. Crews from the Luftwaffe's surface units hauled 37 Lebedian and 20mm autocannons back from the edges of the fields and stationed them roughly a kilometer distant, with the aim of engaging the P-47s prior to their diving into striking distance. The strategy proved futile. The U.S. pilots descended to low altitudes, skillfully employing natural contours of the landscape and rows of trees to conceal their advance right up to the edge of the anti-aircraft fire zone. Once the defenses began to lock on, the P-47 Thunderbolts unleashed their attacks and roared overhead at velocities beyond what the artillery crews could hope to counter. To compound the issue, situating the flak units out in exposed meadows rendered them vulnerable in turn. Crews flying the P-47s took to targeting these gun emplacements directly, raking them with bursts from 50 caliber machine guns that inflicted heavy losses among the operators. A commander of one such German flak unit close to Drouer noted the deaths of 17 personnel over a 3-week span, all without managing to down even a single enemy plane. While the spotter system proved somewhat more reliable, it introduced complications of its own. Drawing from French locals, ranging from eager supporters to those under duress, the Luftwaffe enlisted them to monitor highways and open areas around bases, relaying alerts by phone upon detecting the sound of incoming engines. This arrangement afforded the Germans perhaps 30 additional seconds of notice, sufficient for aviators to dash clear of their machines, preserving their lives even as the aircraft themselves went up in flames. Within mere days, members of the French underground unraveled the workings of this vigilance setup and began injecting bogus intelligence, prompting Luftwaffe teams to rush toward hiding spots for non-existent raids as authentic P-47 strikes hammered unrelated sites. Come mid-May, the flood of deceptive signals had so thoroughly undermined the observer chain that German leaders dismissed it as unreliable. In a bit of sheer exigency, the dispersal strategy emerged as the final resort. Rather than aligning planes in orderly formations adjacent to the airstrip, ideal for servicing and quick scrambles, Luftwaffe maintenance teams resorted to stashing solitary fighters amid woodland clusters, within farm outbuildings, and inside disguised shelters dotted throughout the rural expanse. Such concealment shielded the machines from low-level sweeps, yet it crippled their combat effectiveness. For instance, retrieving a Bf-109 from a rural shed located 2 kilometers from the tarmac demanded a full 20 minutes to taxi back, refuel, load munitions, and take off. The very essence of an interceptor airfield hinged on swift reaction times. Through their tactics, the Americans compelled the Luftwaffe into a grim dilemma: safeguard the fighters or deploy them in battle. Opting for safety, they ensured that surviving aircraft remained grounded, unfit for action. In late May, Galland launched a final gambit with Operation Werger, deploying FW-190s reinforced with extra plating and potent guns specifically to pursue those skimming close attackers. The concept behind the operation held that these robustly equipped aircraft would conduct patrols at very low heights, ambushing P-47s right in the midst of their ground attack dives, at a moment when the U.S. pilots were fixated on targets below. Yet it collapsed in utter disarray. Compared to their unmodified counterparts, the reinforced FW-190s proved sluggish and far clumsier in handling, and operating just 50 feet off the ground turned those flaws into deadly liabilities. During the initial 7 days of the Werger missions, the Luftwaffe saw 6 of these altered planes destroyed, all without managing even one enemy downed. The initiative was subsequently dropped without fanfare. The hedge-hopping maneuver proved impossible to counter, as it blatantly disregarded the rules of conventional combat. This approach targeted all vulnerabilities in the Luftwaffe's air defenses at the same moment. While the Germans might adjust to a single aspect or perhaps a pair of them, handling the full array simultaneously lay beyond their reach. Come June 1944, the Luftwaffe's leaders stationed in France confronted a harsh truth. Their planes faced peril even when parked, during takeoff, and with American attacks capable of hitting any spot whenever they chose. What was once command of the skies had morphed into sheer aerial dread. Operating just 50 feet above the earth demanded acquiring a whole fresh vocabulary for staying alive, one utterly disconnected from Luftwaffe doctrine. Even if you perfected all combat strategies and carried out flawless strafing passes, death could still claim you when a swarm of starlings burst into your cockpit at 350 miles per hour. On May 3, 1944, Lieutenant James Goodson from the 4th Fighter Group discovered this firsthand, as a bird collision demolished his windscreen while flying over the Loire Valley. With blood, feathers, and shattered plexiglass pelting his features, vision halved, and ferocious winds battering his eyes at 300 miles per hour, he somehow gripped the control column firm and ascended beyond the lethal low altitude. A pilot touched down on an improvised landing field, his face pierced by fragments of glass lodged in his cheeks. The creature involved turned out to be a crow. From then on, aviators began referring to such birds as airborne shrapnel, and honed their ability to detect unusual avian movements. When flocks dispersed suddenly, It signaled the presence of hazards ahead, perhaps foliage, cables, or even rival planes. Avian creatures possessed a superior awareness of the local geography compared to human flyers. Electrical cables posed an even greater threat, since they remained concealed right up to the point of collision. In the French countryside, the power network formed a lethal lattice suspended from timber supports, precisely at the height where U.S. aircraft skimmed the ground. These slender strands blended seamlessly into the surroundings, all but undetectable, yet they were taut with enough force to shear through metal, as effortlessly as a garrote through soft material. During the months of April and May in 1944, the 8th Air Force suffered the destruction of 9 P-47 fighters due to encounters with these overhead lines. These incidents did not qualify as battle damage or hostile engagements. Instead, they were logged in records merely as collisions with barriers encountered while flying close to the Earth. Lieutenant William O'Brien collided with one such cable close to Chartres, where it coiled around his propeller and dragged 3 utility poles to the ground before finally breaking free. The impact almost tore the power plant loose from the fuselage. He managed to cover another 10 miles in the air before the shaking compelled him to parachute to safety. When recovery teams located the P-47, they discovered 40 feet of copper cabling still entwined in the propeller assembly. The mental strain of skimming over hedges went beyond mere dread of death. All fighter pilots in combat grappled with it constantly, the dread of perishing in a foolish way. When death struck high in the sky, it counted as battle, dignified. A condolence note would reach your family, praising your courage. But skimming just 50 feet off the deck, a fatal crash meant you'd erred engaging a slope, overlooked a smokestack, or lost focus for the briefest moment. Your fellow flyer would log it simply as crashed into terrain, and the truth of your blunder would spread through the ranks. This awareness imposed a psychological weight too heavy for certain airmen to shoulder. In May 1944, 3 members of the 56th Fighter Group sought reassignment to high-altitude bomber protection roles, seeking relief from the relentless tension of low-flying operations. Among them was a captain boasting 14 victories, who confided to the medical officer that he'd take on the full might of the Luftwaffe at 20,000 feet any day over enduring one more sortie hugging the treetops. The doctor granted the switch with no reproach, as the sentiment resonated with all who knew the realities. The demands on the body proved just as punishing. Sustaining top velocity over prolonged durations, all while vigilantly surveying the landscape and potential dangers, induced a weariness that surpassed typical battle strain. For a full 2 hours, adrenaline surged relentlessly through your system. Your gaze ached from following earthbound landmarks hurtling toward you at 6 miles each minute, and your arms and hands wrestled with endless tiny adjustments to maintain the plane's equilibrium at heights, where even a 2-degree error spelled instant doom. Upon returning from such a low-skimming sortie, aviators would discover their flying gear drenched in perspiration, even amid temperatures hovering at 50 degrees. Certain individuals struggled to grip a mug of coffee without shaking for a solid hour post-landing. Medical officers in the flight clinic recorded instances where aviators' handshakes were so intense that they were unable to pen their mission debriefs and resorted to verbal accounts. Others, however, adjusted in ways that veered into peril. Those aviators who, after enduring countless operations unscathed, began embracing needless hazards, convinced of their indestructibility. They would dip to 30 feet rather than the prescribed 50. They would assault objectives under the full glare of daytime sun that prudence dictated avoiding altogether. Unit leaders kept a sharp eye on such tendencies, knowing full well that hubris at those elevations guaranteed a fatal outcome without exception. It was merely a matter of time. In May, Major Gerald Johnson sidelined one of his top flyers for 7 days after the man chose to pass beneath a rail span rather than above it, not for breaching any rules, but for having shed his sense of caution. Hovering at 50 feet, a proper dose of apprehension was the sole safeguard for survival. Let it slip away, and you were destined to join the tally of the fallen. June 6, 1944, 05:30 hours. As the first light of day pierced the skies above Normandy, 156,000 soldiers from the Allied forces stormed onto 5 coastal landing zones in what stands as the grandest seaborne invasion ever mounted by humanity. Success for the whole endeavor hinged on a single vital premise. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, would stay away. This wasn't about their inability to appear, it was about their unwillingness, given that U.S. fighter planes would turn any effort by the enemy to approach the shore into a fatal endeavor. Supreme Commander Eisenhower had staked the entire campaign on dominance of the skies, and now the low-flying P-47 Thunderbolts were ready to prove that gamble right. Even prior to the initial assault boats reaching the shore, 289 of these powerful aircraft were roaring low over the fields of northern France, skimming just above the treetops as they targeted every German airfield within a 150-mile radius of the shoreline. The assault commenced precisely at 0445 hours, a full 90 minutes ahead of the designated H hour. Its precision was impeccable, designed to strike the enemy at their weakest point, just as they readied their early morning reconnaissance flights to probe the Allied armada that German radar operators had monitored throughout the night. Over at Creel Airfield, situated 35 miles to the north of Paris, a squadron of Bf-109 fighters was rolling toward their launch spots when suddenly 8 P-47s from the 78th Fighter Group emerged from the dimness before sunrise. The Luftwaffe aviators sat with their cockpits uncovered, meticulously reviewing their gauges and utterly absorbed in their takeoff preparations. They perished without a glimpse of the force that ended their lives. In the span required to peruse this very passage, 18 Bf-109s lay in ruins. Over Beauvais, Abbeville, and Amiens, the grim spectacle unfolded repeatedly. German fighters erupted in flames without a chance to shield the shorelines on the verge of falling. That morning, the low-level darting maneuvers, born of necessity, quickly advanced beyond mere ground-level assaults into a far more intricate strategy. Coordinated fighter engagements delivered unrelenting passes. As one squadron wrapped up its strike and veered away, a fresh group dove in from an alternate angle. The enemy enjoyed no pause whatsoever. Snippets from radio chatter revealed Luftwaffe directors issuing frantic, clashing directives, struggling to guide their planes against dangers assaulting from all sides at once. At 0620 hours, Jagdgeschwader 26 strove to send a staffel aloft from L'Île Vendeville toward the beaches. They managed to lift off just 4 planes before P-47s pummeled the base. Those 4 in the air fell prey to P-51s lurking at high elevation above the clouds. Not a single one made it to the shoreline. This methodical annihilation extended past mere plane losses. It aimed to shatter the Luftwaffe's resolve to mount any effort at all. By 0800 hours, with U.S. forces battling the waves at Omaha Beach, the Luftwaffe had scraped together precisely 2 planes above the landing armada, reconnaissance craft that met swift destruction. Hitler, it was said, passed the morning in fury toward his aerial leaders, bellowing queries about the Luftwaffe's absence. The straightforward reply: they smoldered on bases scattered throughout France. The low-flying raiders executed 847 separate missions that day, sustaining a pace that defied all reason. They shunned tidy 8-hour patrols with downtime. Instead, they soared, touched down, reloaded weapons, and topped off fuel in a mere 20 minutes, then roared back into the sky. Certain pilots notched 4 flights before the sun dipped low. Support teams toiled with frenzied zeal, leaving several overcome by fatigue. Through the bright daylight, the P-47s pressed further, methodically dismantling every element heading for Normandy. Rail lines, vehicle columns, petroleum stores, spans over water. Anything poised to bolster a German push turned into an urgent mark. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski, a squadron intercepted a column of German panzer tanks as they pushed forward in the direction of Caen. With hatches sealed tight and their crews sealed within, the vehicles advanced along the roadway at full pace, entirely without protection from the skies above. Lacking any bombs for the mission, Gabreski's aircraft relied solely on 50-caliber API ammunition, armor-piercing incendiary projectiles. Diving in to rake the formation from positions targeting the engine decks, the thinnest points in the tank's protective plating, they unleashed a devastating low-level assault. In the chaos, 3 Panzer IVs erupted into flames, their stored rounds detonating in fierce follow-on blasts. The surviving elements of the column broke apart and sought refuge amid the nearby tree line, remaining stalled there well beyond the onset of night. Imagine that intense encounter repeated along 50 separate routes, and the reason becomes clear for the German forces' reinforcements, expected to arrive in Normandy within a mere 6 hours, needing fully 3 days instead. By the time dusk fell on June 6th, the Luftwaffe had managed just 319 missions above the Normandy region, while the Allied pilots had executed 14,674. That vast disparity stemmed from the tactic of hedge-hopping. Those German planes that somehow escaped the devastating strikes on the ground still had to run a perilous gauntlet of American fighters patrolling at low altitudes, stretching from their airfields all the way to the combat zone. Only a handful broke through, and they achieved no meaningful results. The success of the Normandy landings stemmed from the fact that the airspace above those shorelines was under complete Allied command, and that dominance came from P-47 pilots who had dedicated 7 months to mastering the art of destroying an enemy air force while it remained grounded and unable to take off. The triumph of D-Day extended far beyond the sands. It unfolded at just 50 feet above the French countryside, with each incinerated Messerschmitt marking a hard-won victory. The era of hedge-hopping tactics didn't conclude with the war's end. Instead, it transformed the foundational principles guiding how air forces approach close air support and the disruption of enemy ground operations. Come August 1944, every Allied air arm operating in Europe had integrated elements of these treetop-level maneuvers into their strategies. British Typhoons and Tempests began conducting parallel low-altitude assaults. The Soviet Il-2 Sturmoviks, purpose-built for assaulting ground targets, adjusted their flight paths drawing from American post-mission analyses. Even the Luftwaffe attempted to emulate these methods in the limited areas where they still held sway, though by that point, shortages of fuel, insufficient training periods, and depleted aircraft inventories rendered their efforts futile. The P-47 practitioners of hedge-hopping had unveiled a fundamental truth. True air superiority demanded mastery not merely over the heights above the fight, but over every layer of the sky, starting from the Earth's surface and rising indefinitely. Victory could no longer be secured solely from on high. It required unchallenged control across the entire vertical domain. The grim tally of losses ultimately proved the strategy's worth, even amid its steep and unforgiving costs. From April through August 1944, squadrons of P-47s conducting low-altitude strafing runs obliterated 1,123 German planes, while they sat on the ground, along with 2,315 locomotives, more than 9,000 trucks and armored vehicles, and countless bridges and fuel storage sites. In that span, they sacrificed 289 of their own machines, 114 brought down by anti-aircraft fire, 87 felled by terrain hazards and engine breakdowns at skim-the-earth altitudes, 67 engaged and shot down by hostile interceptors, and 21 lost to unidentified factors. This amounted to an attrition rate of about 15% across 5 months of aerial warfare's fiercest engagements ever recorded. Harsh figures, yet they proved manageable. Far more crucially, those neutralized enemy assets on the tarmac could no longer threaten Allied heavy bombers, rake Allied ground forces with machine gun fire, or challenge control of French airspace. In the brutal calculus of wearing down an opponent, victory went to the power able to replenish its depleted ranks. And by the summer of 1944, Germany was clearly not that power. During the Korean War, U.S. aviators drew on those same low-flying doctrines to ravage North Korean and Chinese targets with overwhelming success. F-80s and F-84s thundered over Korea's landscape at treetop height, pounding convoys of supplies and enemy bases with techniques honed in the skies above France 10 years prior. Although velocities had surged with the shift from piston engines to jets, the core methodology stayed unchanged. Embrace low-altitude flights, maintain high speeds, leverage the landscape for cover, and strike enemies before they detect your presence. The Vietnamese forces absorbed these harsh truths during encounters with U.S. F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs, conducting close-to-the-ground interdiction operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While the jargon evolved, replacing hedge-hopping with nap-of-the-earth maneuvers, the fundamental approach echoed the Thunderbolt strategies of 1944 without alteration. Even today, the principles of close air support in modern military practice bear the unmistakable influence of those P-47 aviators. The A-10 Warthog, engineered in the 1970s expressly for ground assaults at low levels, drew directly from the experiences gained over France, featuring robust underbelly shielding, backup flight controls, armaments tailored for terrestrial threats, and pilot instruction focused on concealing movements with natural features alongside rapid ingress tactics. Within Air Force survival training programs, instructors continue to impart the hard-won insights that Hub Zemka's squadron uncovered via relentless experimentation. While higher elevations offer better sight lines, skimming the surface delivers the element of shock. Rapid velocity near the Earth provides superior defense compared to agility up high, and the terrain itself becomes a formidable ally when wielded effectively. although the planes themselves evolved and the weaponry grew far more advanced, the essential strategy of harnessing geography and velocity to secure battlefield unpredictability endured as an unshakable tenet. Perhaps the enduring mental impact outweighs the operational one. That era of low-level daring demonstrated how established beliefs could falter, how strategies drafted in times of calm might prove useless amid the chaos of combat casualties, and how the most effective solutions often appear utterly reckless at first glance. Hub Zemka faced court-martial proceedings precisely 0 times for his unapproved tactical innovations. Rather than that, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. The Army Air Forces, which evolved into the Independent Air Force, absorbed a vital cultural insight on fostering innovation amid intense combat. Confronted by intolerable casualties, the approach isn't to intensify the existing methods. Instead, one scrutinizes all assumptions, explores other options, and encourages lower-ranking officers to innovate freely. This adaptable mindset embedded itself within the principles of American aerial warfare. If you visit the Air Force Museum in Dayton nowadays, you'll see a P-47 Thunderbolt hanging overhead, with its display label highlighting its role in escorting high-altitude bombers and featuring its enormous radial engine. Such details ring true historically, yet they fall short of the full picture. The Thunderbolt's true essence emerged as its deadliest asset during low-level flights, as aviators directed that formidable nose downward toward the earth rather than upward, transforming it into a skimming hunter that schooled a whole cohort of flyers in the art of combat at heights where the laws of physics and the element of shock outweighed any edge from superior elevation. Over the course of 7 months, hugging the terrain at just 50 feet, and defying conventional protocols entirely. That's the strategy American airmen used to ambush the Luftwaffe unexpectedly and advance the overall campaign.